In this video, we're going to talk about program flow, and we'll start talking about selection statements and then follow it up with iteration statements. Now, if you haven't done so already, I really encourage you to read the lesson text for Lesson 9 as well as the extended readings that are listed in that lesson. When we talk about program flow, what we mean is modifying how the application executes based on either conditions within our application or, in the case of iteration statements, looping through a series of items. This changes the flow of the application from a line by line by line basis, and it could potentially skip lines or repeat lines of code depending on the syntax that we choose to use. So we're going to look at first the selection statements, and selection statements allows us to add some intelligence to our applications. And by intelligence, I mean that our applications can make decisions about what it should do based on checks or evaluations of values within our application. So what you see here is a simple application called Lesson 09, and it's a simple WinForm application that simply has a text box that's called TXT taxable amount, and then a button called BTN Calculate. Now let's write some code for the BTN Calculate event handler, and what I want to do is grab the value from the TXT taxable amount text box and put it in a variable called taxable amount. So here we go. Let's go ahead and put our cursor in here. Double taxable amount. Then the next line of code will go taxable amount equals double dot parse You should be able to recognize what's happening in this line of code. It takes the value that the user entered into the TXT taxable amount text box and converts it from a string to a double data type, and then it stores it in a variable that we created called taxable amount. Let's add our first selection statement, and we'll use an if statement to begin with. So let's read the code. It says, if the taxable amount is greater than 100, then take the taxable amount variable and set it equal to the taxable amount variable times 0.95. So if this statement is true, then we'll execute this line of code. If not, then we'll simply skip that line of code and continue executing the rest of the lines of code in the application, which in this case, it just ends. Let's go ahead and add one additional statement to this if syntax, and that is the else syntax. And let me just do something right under here. Okay, so if this statement returns true, we understand that we'll execute this line of code. But if this statement returns false, the else statement will cause this line of code to be executed. Either way, after it executes either this line or that line of code, then it'll execute this line of code and then continue, and the event will be finished. So let's run this application and see how this works. I've already preset a value in here of 105. Let's go ahead and use that to calculate. So in this case, if we were to take 105, what would we expect? We would expect it to be greater than 100. So looking back at our code here, just covering up the result, the taxable amount that we typed in was 105. So we should take the taxable amount and multiply it by 0.95, which should give us our 99.75. Now let's go ahead and put in 95 instead and hit calculate, and this time we get 85.5. So it should have taken 95 is not greater 100, so it should execute this line of code and then display it. Now what happens if we just type in 100? Okay, it returns 90. Now let's look and see why that's the case. Is 100 greater than 100? That is a false statement. 100 is equal to, or maybe equal to or greater than 100. So we would take the taxable amount of 100, multiply it by 0.9, which would return 90, and then we display it here in a message box. So it seems like our application works. Now I'm going to add on to the if-else statement, and this time I'm going to insert one more if statement. I'm doing this so I can check taxable amount to make sure that the value isn't too small. This is sometimes referred to as validation. So if the user now types in a taxable amount of, let's say, 8 or 9, we're going to say, no, that's too small. At a minimum, it has to be 10. So let's test this briefly here, just to make sure. And you can see, even though we typed in 8, it set the lowest value equal to 10. Now what's most important about this is the structure of the if-else statement. I can have multiple if statements to test a condition, and then finally, if none of those conditions are met, for example, if it's not greater than 100 and it's not less than 10, then we can perform this line of code. So it's kind of a default. Now I'm going to move on to a different type of selection statement, and that is the switch statement. So let's go back over here. You'll notice that I already had a combo box control on my WinForm, and it's named CBO Country. And if you scroll down to the items collection near the bottom, here we go, items, I'm going to select a little ellipsis, and you'll notice that I've already input Canada, USA, UK, and Mexico, one per line, and so these will show up in the drop-down list box. That's how one way you can add items to your list box. Now the next thing that I want to do is whenever I click the calculate button, I want it to take the taxable amount and then determine the tax rate based on the country that's selected in my combo box. So let's go to the code, the event handler, and right here I'm going to add some more code. And this time I just pasted in a bunch of code because I didn't want to have to type all this out. I make lots of typing mistakes. So let's take a look at what we have here. The first line of code is simply creating a new variable called tax rate of type double. And now what we want to do is look at our combo box, our CBO country, and based on the selected text, we want to determine a tax rate. So in the case of a Canada selection, it'll set the tax rate equal to 0.085. In the case of the USA selection, it'll set the tax rate to 0.075, and so on for the UK. And then you'll notice that at the very bottom I have a default. This acts much like in the same way that the else statement did in our if-else structure just that we looked at just a moment ago. You'll notice that there's a break statement after each assignment of the tax rate variable, and the reason for the break is to basically kick us out of our switch statement after this block of code is finished executing, so that we don't continue to evaluate the other cases that might be included in the switch statement. Also, one other note, the default statement is completely optional. We do not have to have one of those in our switch statement. So let's go ahead and run our application. Well, actually, before we do, let's change what we're going to display. I'm going to copy and paste over the existing variable that we display in our message box, and now we're going to display the tax rate based on the selection. So now I'm going to click the Run button. I'm going to select the UK and then click the Calculate button. And you'll see that it evaluates to 0.09. Let's check our work to make sure that's true. And indeed, as you can see here, tax rate equals 0.09. So our switch statement works just fine. Now let's run the application one more time to exercise our default statement. And this time I'm going to select Mexico and click Calculate. And as you can see, I have 0.05. The reason why I came back with 0.05 was that we didn't select Canada, the USA, or the UK, so our default statement jumps into action and sets the tax rate equal to 0.05. Okay, so now we're going to move on to iteration statements to modify the program flow. And we're going to add two text boxes onto our form. And this one I'm going to name txt4. And this one I'm going to name txt_while. And iteration statements will make a lot more sense whenever we get into arrays and collections, which is coming up in a lesson just a little bit down the road from here. And I'm going to do a very mundane, very easy example right now, just so you can see how it's used. It may not make a lot of sense at this point why you'd want to use iteration statements, but it should give you some idea of at least how it works. So what I'm going to do is go into the form load event. And here I'm going to type in So as you can see here in our for statement, we have three parts: our initializer, our condition, and our iterator. And these three parts basically create, first of all, a counter variable that's called current item. I can call this whatever I want to, but it's of type integer, and I'm going to initialize its value to 0. The next section is going to be the condition, how long this will actually continue to loop in the for statement, and while current item is less than 10, we'll continue to perform any of the code in the code block between our curly braces. And finally, each time that the block of code is performed, there will be a increment of the current item variable. So we're going to add 1 to it, and that's what that little plus plus means on the very end. Now remember, in C#, since I've only got one line of code in the curly braces, I can omit or use those curly braces like I've done. But either way, that line of code will run until we've satisfied the requirement of the for statement. In this case, we're going to run this so that the current item is 0 through 9. And after the 10th time, it's going to exit the for statement and move on to the rest of the code in my form load. So let's just run the application and see what happens here. And you can see I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it worked just perfectly. It just went through, and each time we iterated through our code block, we just basically took whatever the variable, the iterator was, set to during that iteration and printed it into our text box. One of the distinguishing features of the for statement is that we know in advance how many times we're going to iterate through the code block below it. In this case, we know if we start at 0 and we'll continue looping through one by one until we reach the number 10, then we know that we'll have exactly 10 iterations. Let me show you another type of iteration statement that's a little bit different but still has actually quite a bit of usage within C#, and that is the while statement. And I'm going to just paste some code right in here underneath the for statement. Okay, right off the bat you can see the while statement is dramatically different from the for statement. It only has the condition. It doesn't have the initializer, or it doesn't have the iterator. We'll have to create these for ourselves. As you can see here, outside of the while statement, I have created this item equal to 1. So here's my initializer. And then within the body of the while code block, I have the iterator. Keep in mind that this is a fairly simple example, but you can already see that I have a little bit more control over how the iteration process works by keeping it in the body of the while statement. In this case, I'm jumping by 2's. So if I were to run this and start at 1 and end up at 11 and increment by 2's each time that we loop through or iterate through this code block, let's take a look and see what happens. We have 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, just the odd numbers. Of course, when we get to the number 11, it'll break out and continue on with the code execution of our method. There's actually several other permutations of the iteration statement. We're not going to take the time to go through all of them right now. If you will read the extended readings for the lesson, you'll see quite a few of them documented in the C# specification. There are different reasons to use the different iteration statements, and right now it's probably not very obvious why you'd want to use one over the other. To begin with, just to get started, don't spend a lot of time worrying about this. Just whenever it comes time to use an iteration statement, you'll know what it looks like, you'll know how to use a basic one, and as time goes on, you'll progress and begin to understand more of the permutations and be able to explore those. Let's try one other example. In this case, I'm going to use both the iteration and the selection statements and show how these two can work together. So I'm going to paste some more code into our Form 1 load event. And you can see here I start with the for statement. I create current item. I set it equal to 1 to begin with, and the condition is while current item is less than 11, continue the for loop and iterate one time each time that we finish the code block. Within the body of the for loop, you'll notice that I have a selection statement. If the current item equals 4, then perform this code block. When we find the fourth item, we'll display a message, we found item 4, and then we'll use the break statement. Do you remember what that does? It works the same way as the break statement that we looked at just a moment ago with the switch, and it'll basically kick us out of this for loop. So now let's run the application, and in the form load, you'll notice before it even displays, we get our message box, we found item 4, and it continues on. This doesn't really tell us a whole lot, so what I'm going to do is actually create what's called a breakpoint right here, and we'll talk more about debugging and breakpoints in a lesson near the end of this series. But this will allow me to step through and watch the line execution, each line of code executing line by line. So this time I'm going to hit the run button, and then I'm going to use my little step into. Now you can see this little yellow area is the current line of code that is being executed by the compiler. So I'm going to click the Step Into, and you can see that it goes through current item equals 1. And you can see I can hover my mouse cursor over a given variable in order to see what the value is in a little pop-up box. And I can watch it as it executes. Now, if current item equals 4, which it does not, so as you can see, it jumped from here. It didn't try to execute any of these lines of code. Instead, it's going to add 1 to current item. So let's step through one more time. And now let's see what current item equals. It equals 2. So we can continue this process of checking, and then iterating. Okay, this time current item equals 4, so it moves into this code block underneath the if statement. And this time when we run the statement, we get a message box pop up. Now we're going to hit our break statement, and it kicks us completely out of the for loop and throughout the rest of the form 1 load event handler, and then to the end of the application. So in this lesson you saw several live examples of both selection statements and iteration statements, and I highly recommend that you read not only the lesson text but also the extended readings for lesson 9, because there's a lot of additional variations on what I've shown you here, and you'll get a better insight if you take the time to read the C# specification. Thank you.